We're going to be looking at the post-1949, that is the post-Chinese Revolution time period. And first of all, we're going to start out and look at 8 different points about kind of communism in general, but more specifically Chinese communism. Communism, number one, is an ideology. And as an ideology, in fact, it's also an historical explanation of, mankind. And that at least was what Karl Marx meant when he asserted that class conflict between the bourgeoisie, between kind of the middle class, the merchant class, would result in a revolution of the proletariat, the working classes against the bourgeoisie. And eventually that in communism, the government would completely disappear. So I don't want you to confuse this with socialism, because historically there were many different socialist theories and branches of socialism that preceded, well in advance, decades in advance of Karl Marx. And certainly socialism has evolved up to the present day as well. So many socialist parties throughout the world today in different countries know that they can try to work through democratic systems of government to achieve their own ideological principles. And those ideological principles are not necessarily anti-capitalistic or anti-democratic at all. They're merely a recognition by socialists that they believe that private interest alone cannot determine a kind of equal playing field for everyone, that the government would need to assist in leveling the playing field for everyone. In other words, they would tend to think that human beings are selfish at heart and that selfishness needs to be contained by government action. So please do not at all confuse Chinese communism or the communism that had existed in the Soviet Union with socialist parties throughout the world today. And to confuse the two would be a major mistake. Number 2, besides being an ideology, communism is a form of government. And since communists saw communism as really the only correct, the only true ideology in their mind, they felt in both the Soviet Union and in the People's Republic of China that there could be no competing ideologies. And that is, in other words, there could be no competing political parties. And so in states like China, the Communist Party is the party, and it is also the state. It determines, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, determines policy and also runs the government. And this is what we would see as a dual governmental structure, literally parallel structures set up. One of those parallel structures we're going to look at today is the National Party Congress versus the National People's Congress. Perfect example of a parallel structure. Keep that in mind when we discuss those in a couple of minutes. Or as your book, John Starr, discusses, the party proposes and the government disposes. So in other words, it is a party state. The party and the state are one and the same, even though there may be separate dual governmental structures or parallel structures. At the very top of the Chinese Communist Party today is the General Secretary, and he's at the top of the Politburo and its standing committee. Below it is the Central Committee, which is composed of about 285 Chinese Communist Party members. Then below it is the National Party Congress, which meets every 4 to 5 years. During Mao Zedong's time, it actually met only twice. And every 4 or 5 years, it elects the Central Committee, and that's its major duties. Well, besides being an ideology and a form of government, communism is also an economic system. And it's an economic system that's generally associated with a command economy. So what do we mean by a command economy? A command economy is an economy that is commanded from the top. So in the case of the revolution in the Soviet Union or in communist China, the government underwent a nationalization of private property, right? So businesses and factories, etc., land was all nationalized. This is in opposition to what we're accustomed to in the United States and in the West as a market economy. So the two are different, a command economy versus a market economy. Now, in the heyday of Chinese communism and of Soviet communism, the command economy was in operation. From the 1970s on, the late 1970s on, as we will see, in Chinese communism, there was an opening up to market forces. And so today, China, although it remains a communistic society, a communistic political system, has opened itself up to features of a market economy. Number 4, besides being an ideology and a form of government and an economic system, communism is a unitary form of government. By a unitary form of government, we mean a government where decisions are made at the top. That is, the top names provincial officials, etc. The provinces, the localities largely exist to carry out the policies of the Communist Party. Now, this is in great contrast to the United States, for instance, where we have a federal system. So in a federal system, there's a distinguishment between what the national government has power over and what state governments have powers over. In other words, the national and state governments have separate spheres. But in a unitary form of government, like that in Chinese communism, everything comes from the top and trickles on down. Now, just like the United States has states, so too China has provinces, but they're kind of different than our states. There are 34 provinces as Chinese communists see themselves because they count as the 34th Taiwan, which to them is just a runaway province, which is still part of China. Now, of those, 23 are more what we would think of as larger provinces of sort of like large states. 4 of those are actually urban city governments. 2 are special administrative regions, and that would be Hong Kong and Macau, and we know why that happened, because Hong Kong had been controlled by Britain and Macau had been controlled by Portugal, and of course they were both given back to China. And then there are 5 autonomous regions, which are largely areas that have large ethnic populations, that is, populations other than the Han kind of Chinese populations. And these populations, might be also religiously affiliated, say, for instance, largely Islamic and largely in the West, or Buddhist, etc. Now, you might say, well, if everything comes from the top, then there is no way that the localities, the provinces, can resist anything that the top wants. And we're going to talk about 2 things. One is under this unitary form of government, that's not exactly the case. At the localities and provinces, officials, if they disagree with something, could just be inactive. They could, have a kind of a passive resistance. Now, again, they have to watch that so that it doesn't become, it doesn't go from passive to, right, actual seen as revolutionary, because certainly we're going to see instances, say, as in the case of Tiananmen Square, where any revolutionary activity has been quelled. There was in 1998 a law passed which allowed village elections. So actually, by 2004, of the China's 680,000 village administrative committees, more than 90% of them were popularly elected. But I don't want to give the impression that this is some kind of creeping democracy, because it exists at the village level and it certainly doesn't apply beyond that. Now, besides the fact that communism is an ideology, a form of government, an economic system, a unitary form of government, it also, in the case of China, includes a paramount thing, and that is relationships, guanxi. Relationships are very important in Chinese society, have always been so. You know, in fact, that's a part of Confucianism itself, that sort of collective identity. The importance of building consensus, if possible from the bottom up. And this certainly ties into passive resistance, except in a more positive manner. It can lead to sort of special deals. So you might work out, the national government, the Chinese Communist Party might work out a special deal with Shanghai that it doesn't have in Guangzhou. And those special deals would be something that would be more unusual in the United States, where we really try to abide by the rule of law. Now, those special deals may enable things to get done, but they can also have a more dark side, and that is corruption. And of course, we know that corruption has been rampant, even in China during the imperial system before the revolution, during the period of the warlords also, and since the revolution of 1949 as well. The next thing is that in a communist society, the legislature is really largely powerless. So the legislature is the National People's Congress, which is composed of 2,900 and some different members, almost 3,000 members. It generally meets annually in March, and it's really there to approve the Chinese Communist Party's policies. In that respect, we could say that in a political science sense, the members of the National People's Congress really almost act as ombudsmen. They go back to their provinces and they carry back with them the latest news about what the party has done and determined and the latest laws, etc. Now, they might vote against certain reports, they may abstain, but generally they're there to sort of rubber stamp the way things are. That's obviously in complete contrast to the Diet of Japan or the U.S. Congress or Britain's Parliament, etc., which are actually true legislative bodies and are not there to rubber stamp, but actually are there to legislate. Number 7. Unlike all of those places that we've just mentioned, the United States or Germany or Japan or Britain, the communist societies, communist nations like the Soviet Union and in the case of the People's Republic of China have been very closely tied to the military. In China's case, to the People's Liberation Army. And we'll see some examples where they actually have had to kind of move in and settle things down. Number 8, communist societies, nations like the Soviet Union and China generally keep close surveillance of their populations. And the reason for this is if the communist ideology is seen as the true ideology, then they want to make certain that the masses of the people are not going down, say, a revisionist road or are not receding back into capitalist and bourgeois kinds of ideas. So in old China, the Dan Wei were the ways that you kind of kept surveillance of everyone. And the Danwei, if you were a student or a teacher, it would be your school. If you were a factory worker, it would be your factory. If you were retired, it would be your neighborhood. And literally someone was responsible, or some people were responsible, to literally keep a file on everybody. And you weren't allowed to go from one Danwei to another Danwei. And in fact, you know, if you did get permission to move from one Danwei to another, then your file would go with you to that next Danwei. Now, obviously today, where things have become more of a market economy, where there's been an opening up to private enterprise, there are as many as 150 million migrant workers who are not within their old Danweis in China, and nearly 100 million people working for private companies, which of course don't keep these records as well. So that's well over 250 million people, or 250 million people, who are out of that Danwei system. And in that sense, then, there's less surveillance of the population, has been a feature of the past. Please know, though, that the same thing largely was true of foreign visitors and foreigners who came to China. You know, as late as 1990, when I went to China, literally a year after the revolution at Tiananmen Square, the Chinese were very suspicious. At that time, there was only one tourist company, and that was run by the Chinese communists themselves, by the government. There weren't any other private companies that dealt with foreign tourism to China. So, you know, I had asked early on, since we were going to be in Beijing on a Sunday, if I and some of our professors and students, I went with a lot of professors from California, if we could go attend a Catholic Mass at the Beijing Cathedral. And they did everything they could to put up all kinds of roadblocks to that, saying that they didn't have the telephone number, they didn't know when the Mass was. All of that was untrue, because the Chinese Communist Party at that time was the only one that kept the, you know, telephone numbers for everything and everybody. And then finally they said, well, okay, but you can go, the Masses at 9:30, but by the way, we're moving the bus to the Great Wall, the trip to the Great Wall, up to like 10 o'clock. So we would have had literally a half an hour to leave the hotel, go across town, go to Mass, come back, and be in time. Obviously, none of us wanted to miss the Great Wall. They did that very, very intentionally, because they didn't want us to see what religion, how religion had so very few freedoms, or to get to talk to anybody. The reason why I mention it under surveillance is after I was leading that effort, it was very clear to me, and the Chinese made it very clear to me, that even when we were off on our own, they knew where I was. And they would ask me, oh, so you and your students today went to Tiananmen Square and went to see Mao's tomb, and you know, they would know where I was at all times. So in that kind of thing, they don't even hide it. They let you know that you're that you're under surveillance. Now again, China has changed a lot since 1990, but I like telling that story because it's a story that captures what it was like in China when things were more heavily surveilled, when there was greater surveillance, than there is now. Let's discuss a little bit about Tibet. Tibet is, the Tibet Plateau is right along the border here with India, and a number of Buddhists live there. In 1950, China, a year after the revolution, said Tibet has always been historically tied to China. We must invade it and include it in China itself. 6 years later, rebellion broke out in Tibet, which was crushed by 1959 by China. And at that time, the Dalai Lama pictured here, fled to India, where he established a Tibetan government in exile. 30 years later, of course, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. So, 1949, the revolution, the Communist Revolution occurred. People's Republic of China was declared. And after 1949, China needed to be completely reorganized economically. So a nationalization began. Private companies were nationalized by the state, and in the agricultural sector, land was redistributed to the peasants. Now, there are a number of significant years where things seem to happen, 1953 being one of them, 1976 being another year. And so I want to kind of look at China in terms of some of those significant dates. The first of those after the revolution would be 1953. In 1953, the government began collectivization, taking these separate peasant holdings and putting them into larger collectives, which literally were cooperative units that would share animals, tools, machineries, etc. Now, Stalin had done the same sort of thing and had forced collectivization on the peasants in the Soviet Union, leading to many, many deaths and purges, and it was a complete disaster. China was careful to avoid that forced collectivization of Stalin's Soviet Union. China preferred a more gradual approach and did get a greater cooperation of Chinese peasants for this collectivization effort. Also in 1953, the French army lost a major battle at Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam against the communist Viet Minh led by Ho Chi Minh. Now, the importance of this is, as we've stated before in this class, that China always regarded, Southeast Asia, places like Vietnam, as being historically within its sphere of influence. These are areas that had been tributary states to China in the past. And China was certainly not only going to be supportive of Vietnam, but of communists in Vietnam. So the reason why the French lost at Dien Bien Phu had a lot to do with the fact that the Chinese provided the Viet Minh, the Vietnamese communists, with artillery support. A year after that, by the Geneva Accords of 1954, Vietnam was divided between North Vietnam, which was communist, and South Vietnam. At the 17th parallel, there were to be free elections that occurred. Of course, the same thing happened there as in the two Koreas, and that is a civil war developed, and of course that would draw in and become a Cold War struggle, partly between China and the United States. So keep that in mind, 1953. In 1953, Stalin died in the Soviet Union, and Stalin had always been sort of the figure who represented international communism. And Mao Zedong, having led the revolution in China, felt that he should be kind of the successor. He should be the figure, the face of communism worldwide. But he soon found out that he was not. That the successor to Stalin, who was Nikita Khrushchev, that Khrushchev quickly became that face. And Mao Zedong always just hated the fact that Nikita Khrushchev, kind of usurped from him that role. Mao Zedong regarded Khrushchev as really this uneducated kind of peasant, which is sort of interesting considering that, they're both communist and really were, quote unquote, looking up to peasants. And number 4, in 1953, the Soviet Union tested its first thermonuclear bomb. Now, obviously, this is not the atomic bomb of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is a thermonuclear bomb which would achieve much greater destruction. And at that moment, although it would take, still people would threaten nuclear war, the Soviet Union and the United States by the 1950s were realizing that they needed to coexist and they needed to contain conflicts so that they did not emerge and burst forth into thermonuclear war. Because if they did, it would be the end of both of them and the end of the world. Mao Zedong did not necessarily agree with this. He thought that, the Soviets ought to be willing to risk thermonuclear war just for the sake of communism. The fifth thing that we want to look at is a new president who came to power in 1953, and that was Dwight D. Eisenhower in the United States. And he made it pretty clear that he would not prevent Taiwan from trying to liberate the People's Republic of China, that is, mainland China. And in the following year, 1954, the People's Liberation Army of China began to shell islands in the Taiwan Strait. And these islands, Quemoy and the Matsu Islands, were occupied by Taiwan. This began the first Taiwan Strait crisis, or what is sometimes called the 1954-55 Taiwan Strait crisis. The U.S. threatened to intervene with nuclear weapons in China back down, thus ending the first Taiwan Strait crisis. As you can see from what we've just discussed, from the differences between, say, Mao Zedong and a little bit between Nikita Khrushchev, Mao Zedong remained throughout his life an ideologist. He truly felt that the revolution needed to be an ongoing revolution. And if the masses of the people didn't, from generation to generation, embrace the communist revolution, then it was bound to fail. That elitism, bourgeois influence, corruption would creep in to communist society, and before you know it, recidivism would emerge, revisionism. People would be led back down the capitalist road to capitalism and democracy and so forth. And so, knowing that Mao Zedong was this ideologist who believed in this continuing revolution is helpful in trying to understand his 100 Flowers campaign, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, and a lot of his other movements, which may have seemed to him at the time to be a good idea, but were complete and utter failures. Because again, he was concerned in keeping the masses involved in the sense of revolutionary idealism. There's an old Chinese saying, that sometimes you have to kill the chicken to scare the monkey, and this perhaps is also why he engaged in some of these campaigns, to scare the monkeys. While the Chinese peasants proved perhaps more open to the cause of communism because they had more to gain, intellectuals and others were more reluctant to support communism. And Mao Zedong initially proposed in 1956 to try to get these intellectuals and others who were more reluctant on his side by saying, well, I'm going to open discussion of issues, what he called the 100 Flowers campaign. As he himself said, let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools contend. Well, he may have meant that, and people took him at his word, and things got out of hand. The criticisms of the party and government became too great, and so he stopped the campaign. People who didn't agree with him, party members, were purged. Some intellectuals, they were sent off to the countryside, to rural areas to perform menial labor, to get back with the peasants and understand what this revolution was all about, or they were in prison. So that between this forced labor, imprisonment, purges from the party, it did not end particularly well. Mao Zedong's next campaign was entitled The Great Leap Forward and was begun in 1958. And again, this was illustrative of his viewpoint of communism. He never was a big admirer of central planning, the central planning that was conducted by the Soviets, the central planning that would include all kinds of technocrats and bureaucrats at its heart. Instead, Mao Zedong was ideological. He believed in the people. He was a populist. He believed that the masses of people, that the revolution needed to remain strong in the hearts of the masses of the people, and that, in the end, would accomplish much more than technocrats or bureaucrats from the top giving orders. And so his idea was to engage the masses of people, both in the rural areas and in the cities, in communes. So the basis of his Great Leap Forward was to form communes in rural and urban areas. And these communes were meant to be the centers of economic, social, and political life. So to give an example, in a rural area, the commune would supervise the production of the crops, the agricultural production, the distribution of those crops. It would also act as a banker. It would even establish small factories and machine shops. And the industrialization that Mao Zedong envisioned were, well, let's have all of these kind of backyard steel factories and so forth. They were a tremendous disaster. These communes would operate schools. They would operate hospitals and daycare centers, mess halls where people could eat. They would take care of the aged. They would even, have plays and all kinds of entertainment and art, etc., for the people. Well, the Great Leap Forward was not successful. The communes were too large, and they tried to make efforts to reduce their size. Things weren't quick enough. And meanwhile, natural disasters struck China in 1959, 1960, and 1961. These included droughts and floods, which of course then led to bad harvests, and overall there was a decline in economic output. As many as 30 million people may have died from all of these natural disasters and from the famine. It's interesting that Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union thought that the Great Leap Forward was absolutely ridiculous, that it was folly, and in fact he made it known that he thought it was so. Well, in 1958, the same year that the Great Leap Forward began, the Chinese began to shell the island of Quemoy and the Matsu Islands in the Taiwan Strait, thus beginning the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis, or what's sometimes called the 1958 Taiwan Strait Crisis. Now, they began doing this without letting Nikita Khrushchev and the Russians know, the Soviets know, giving them prior knowledge that they were going to do this. And so Khrushchev was very, very upset. The United States, of course, was upset. It made it known in so many words that it would respond with nuclear weapons if necessary. Fortunately, China ran out of shells and the whole Second Taiwan Strait crisis de-escalated. Well, the Great Leap Forward had not worked, and certainly the situation economically called for new approaches. And by the late 1950s, with the support initially of Mao Zedong, but really under the leadership of two great pragmatists, Liu Shaoqi and Zhou Enlai. These were pragmatic people. They thought that, all of this ideological stuff wasn't working, that they needed to try economic incentives. So they said, in the communes, we can get workers to be more productive by giving those productive workers wage increases or bonuses or promotions. We can give the peasants, little small private plots, and they can grow crops on those private plots and sell them on the free market. Of course, they still were obliged to produce a fixed amount of grain for the state. And so really, largely by about 1962, those old communes had largely disappeared. But not everybody thought that this pragmatic approach of Liu and Zhou Enlai was a good thing. They thought it harkened back to capitalist roads. And to Deng Xiaoping and other pragmatists, it just was practical. It was pragmatic. The end justified the means. As Deng Xiaoping himself said in 1961, speaking of the changes, it did not matter whether a cat was black or white. It was a good cat as long as it caught mice. Now, this extreme pragmatic approach would end up frightening Mao Zedong, who still remained a die-hard ideologist. And this whole thing really frightened him when this play appeared. And the play was called Ha Ryu, Dismissed from Office. And it was an historical play depicting the life of an honest 16th century minister in the imperial court who was wrongly dismissed by a Ming emperor who was very dictatorial. And some claim that this very dictatorial emperor in the play was actually a representation of Mao Zedong. So Mao was just infuriated. He denounced the play. His wife, Jiang Qing, that's Mao's wife, Madame Mao, was an actress from her earlier days, and she supported Mao Zedong, her husband, in conducting artistic censorship. And this was all part of his socialist education movement in 1962. Again, trying to control artists and so forth, and so that they could properly educate the socialist masses and not fall back into this bourgeois mentality. And there wouldn't be falling back into bourgeois mentality either if China was strong. So in 1964, it tested its first nuclear bomb, joining the nuclear club. The socialist education campaign of the 1960s was really only a prelude to the great proletarian cultural revolution, sometimes just called the Cultural Revolution, which went at least from 1965 to 1969. If you think of things historically, by the 1960s, the Long March of the Communists that occurred in 1934, that was 30 years in the past. By 1969, they would be celebrating the 20th anniversary of the revolution, and 20, 30 years, right, had passed, and a whole new generation came forth. A generation that Mao Zedong thought was unfamiliar with the revolutionary struggles of the past. And again, he felt this ideological need to instill within the younger masses of people their own enthusiasm for the communist cause. He felt that colleagues and party members were slipping into new, comfortable, elitist, bourgeois patterns, revisionism. And so he called upon the masses themselves of people to lead a new cultural revolution. And just to show that he was up to the task, he went ahead and displayed his own energy and spirit. A lot of people were questioning, he was 73 years old in 1966, whether he had the health or the youth to still be leader. He went ahead, Mao Zedong, and swam 10 miles of the Yangtze River in record time. And some skeptical observers thought that Mao's famous swim was assisted by underwater frogmen. Aided by the People's Liberation Army, which was under the control of Lin Biao, the Cultural Revolution advanced headlong. Young people were organized into Red Guards, and they paraded around holding copies of Mao's Little Red Book, which was a collection of his quotations, his sayings. The Red Guards went around and they took prominent people, intellectuals, teachers, party leaders, and others who they felt were turning their backs on the revolution, becoming capitalist roaders, becoming revisionists, not strong communists, publicly humiliating them, making them wear dunce caps, and on the dunce caps, would be the written, the charges against them. Beating people, taking people captive, ransacking houses, and literally destroying anything that harkened back to the capitalist past. And so much of China's great artistic works, historical treasures, were destroyed by these young Red Guards who went after destroying anything old or foreign. Luckily, some member of the People's Liberation Army got the army to protect the Forbidden City so that it didn't undergo this great destruction. Well, schools and universities were closed. This is where, of course, a lot of these intellectuals and revisionist party members were, they felt. And that threw back Chinese education and especially science and technology really for decades. Liu Shaoqi was removed from office. He was expelled from the party, sent to a detention camp where he died. Deng Xiaoping got off a little easier. He was forced to confess, dismissed from office, but he was allowed to remain a member of the party. His son, however, somehow fell out a window or was pushed out of a window and was paralyzed. And so, you know, things were not good. People were treated horribly. Zhou Enlai seemed to do pretty well. Lin Biao did well. They weathered the storm. Many people felt that Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, the Madame Mao, was behind a lot of this, which she was in the Cultural Revolution. Well, the Cultural Revolution was over and China slowly resettled. Universities were reopened in 1970, but party politics still remained confusing. In 1969, Lin Biao was named as Mao's successor. But a year later, he had kind of fallen from grace and he wasn't about ready to give up power. And in 1971, Lin responded by trying, supposedly, to stage a coup d'etat. It failed. Lin Biao attempted to flee China on an airplane, which subsequently crashed in Mongolia. What happened is still subject to speculation. So Mao Zedong still doesn't have a successor. And in the interim, why things are kind of a mess domestically, and pretty well put that way because the Cultural Revolution in foreign relations, the 1950s and the 1960s brought additional problems to China. Although China from 1949 throughout for about 10 years to about 1959 had a decent relationship, a good and even later on perhaps only decent relationship with the Soviet Union. Both were, however, after all, communist powers. That relationship during the 1950s gradually began to experience stresses and strains. Part of that was over boundary issues between China and the Soviet Union, mainly in the area of that western province that we know of as Xinjiang. And of course, this was very important because Xinjiang had all kinds of oil and other resources. They also, Soviet Union and China also had a falling out over Taiwan. And the Soviet Union did not really support China's idea of kind of taking back, even, as it tried to do in the second Taiwan Strait crisis of 1958, of taking China back in any kind of military move. Remember, Nikita Khrushchev was upset when he didn't know in advance that China was going to do that in 1958. So it's not surprising that the year after, in 1959, the Soviet Union actually withdrew very many of its technical advisors and scientists that it had sent to China to help the Chinese. And then, of course, both nations were accusing one another of wavering from the true path of Marxism, of communism. The Soviet Union also supported India, which had border disputes with China over Tibet. The situation really became critical in 1962 when a border war between China and India erupted. And then to make matters worse, in 1969, actual conflict, small scale though it may have been, emerged in the area of Manchuria on the island of Damansky, Chenbao Island, at the confluence of the Amur and Ussuri rivers between the Soviet Union and China. Now, as relations with the Soviet Union deteriorated, China's relations with the United States gradually improved. China moved towards a rapprochement with America during the administration of U.S. President Richard Nixon, who promised to withdraw U.S. forces from Vietnam. Then in 1971, the United Nations admitted the People's Republic of China to membership in the place of Taiwan. Zhou Enlai gained further respect in the Chinese public's eye when he headed the delegation that met U.S. President Richard Nixon when Nixon visited China in 1972. Here we see in this photo Zhou Enlai greeting Richard Nixon at the Beijing airport. By the time that the final day of Nixon's historic trip, the U.S. and China issued a joint communique in Shanghai maintaining that, quote, there is but one China, and that Taiwan is a part of China. Well, this was really important. Otherwise, U.S.-Chinese relationships without that kind of communique could have never moved forward. Still, China internally was politically confused. By the early 1970s, the so-called Gang of Four, consisting of Madame Mao and Yao and Zhang and Wang, her cohorts, were really largely controlling and exercising a great deal of influence in proposing the pragmatic people like Zhou Enlai and others. Well, then in 1976, 4 important things happened. One of those pragmatists, Zhou Enlai, died of cancer in January of 1976. And Deng Xiaoping seemed to be the likely successor to be premier, but in a surprise move in February, Mao appointed Hua Guangfeng to the post instead. Deng disappeared from the public scene and was under attack in the press, seen as being a capitalist roader, a person heading people down towards the capitalist road. In July of 1976, an earthquake occurred, rocking Hebei province. It measured 8.2, one of the worst earthquakes in human history. It claimed an immeasurable number of deaths. No one is certain how many people died. The estimates are anywhere from 240,000 to as many as 655,000 people. In a culture that still was peasant-oriented and certainly remembered its history, very oftentimes certain cosmological, natural disasters occurred before the end of a dynasty. So to many in China, it was not surprising that 2 months after the earthquake, on September 9th of 1976, Mao Zedong died of Parkinson's disease. And of course, Hua succeeded Mao. Hua proceeded to move against the Gang of Four. He had them secretly arrested and imprisoned in October of 1976. They were accused of attempting a coup d'etat. And besides holding the premiership, Hua was also elevated to chairmanship of the Chinese Communist Party. But he knew that he lacked a lot of experience, and so Deng Xiaoping was brought back, this great pragmatist, restored to his former offices. He served as vice chair of the party and vice premier of the nation in 1977, and he took charge of the 4 modernizations, namely farming, industry, science, and defense. And these 4 modernizations had been introduced by Zhou Enlai before he died, the year before he died in 1975. In agriculture, peasants were assigned land again, and foreign joint enterprises were encouraged, especially in areas of special economic zones along the coastal area, places like Guangzhou, the old area of Canton. Small-scale businesses were allowed, so these were all market economy kinds of reforms, capitalist kinds of reforms. Chinese could open small-scale businesses of their own. They could open up, beauty salons and little clothing shops and little restaurants, etc. And later on, of course, after foreign enterprises came in, then they would even begin, Deng Xiaoping would begin all of the stuff, especially in the 1980s and 90s, that would lead to taking many of these old state enterprises and privatizing them. And eventually they would come across, bring about the one-child policy in 1984 in China, because obviously China had this significant population explosion. In 1979, a couple of very important things occurred, and this was under the administration of President Jimmy Carter. The United States officially recognized the People's Republic of China. And number two, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. This worried China a lot because of its, western provinces, and because of the fact that some of those western provinces had Muslims in them, and they just worried that the Soviet Union was getting too close for comfort in areas that typically the Chinese like to consider kind of their sphere of influence. By 1980, it was readily accepted both inside China and outside China that Deng Xiaoping, even though he was neither chair of the Communist Party nor premier of the government, was for all intents and purposes, the new leader of the country. By 1980, Hua resigned as premier. His successor as premier was Zhao Ziyang. Further, in 1981, Hua was replaced as party chair by Hu Yaobang. Okay, so there's a new premier and a new party chair by 1980-81. And then the year later, the post of party chair and vice chair were abolished and replaced with general secretary. So Hu became the first general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. The new economic reforms, although welcomed by many, produced new hardships for others. For the first time, really, a concern about unemployment, about inflation. And students at universities became dissatisfied with their inadequate facilities, some of them being put 8 to 10 to a dormitory room, etc. By 1986, 1987, there were student demonstrations being held throughout China, and Deng Xiaoping responded by replacing Hu with Zhao Ziyang as general secretary in 1987. Later on, Deng Xiaoping appointed Li Peng as premier. And also in 1987, Deng Xiaoping pressured the older leaders of the party to resign and to make room for younger colleagues. In fact, Deng Xiaoping himself led the way by stepping down from all of the posts he held, retaining only the chair of the Military Affairs Commission. Now, Zhao continued in the path of Deng Xiaoping, in pursuing economic reforms. In fact, Zhao stated at a party congress in 1987 that China was, quote, now in the primary stage of socialism, and embarked on a process of industrial modernization, which took place under capitalist conditions in other countries. Therefore, China had to keep reforming and pursuing this market economy, letting public and private ownership play a dominant role, and encouraging, as he said, people to become rich first. And in that way, China would establish a true modern socialist society and not a capitalistic society, even though the path involved capitalistic elements. Now we need to give you the backdrop to Tiananmen Square of 1989. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was experiencing economic and political problems, and Mikhail Gorbachev announced glasnost, openness to foreign and other ideas, and an economic restructuring which they called perestroika. This is all happening in the background, and so they're becoming understanding what's happening in China. 1989, huge year. Communism collapsed in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia, and on November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall was opened. On April 15th, 1989, Hu Yaobang, the patron of liberal intellectuals, died. And the next day, students from Beijing University gathered in Tiananmen Square to mourn his death. Over the next several days, the mourners became demonstrators. They began criticizing Deng Xiaoping and clamoring for democracy. In May, Mikhail Gorbachev came to visit China. He was in Beijing, and the demonstrators protested even further because of all of the media from around the world that was there for the visit of Mikhail Gorbachev. Zhao proposed that the situation be handled cautiously. Deng Xiaoping disagreed, making it known that he intended to declare martial law. And in the meantime, the demonstrations became larger and larger because joining the students were citizens of Beijing. In late May of 1989, Zhao was removed as party general secretary. He would die under house arrest in 2005. On June 3, 1989, the government ordered troops and tanks into the city of Beijing, and a bloodbath ensued on June 4th. Anywhere between 4,500 and 10,000 protesters were arrested, and at least 12 and perhaps as many as 100 were executed. In 1989, then, Jiang Zemin became general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. Meanwhile, in 1990, East and West Germany were unified, and by 1991, communism collapsed and the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation formed. And of course, as the Soviet Union fell apart and the Russian Federation was formed, and many of these new Russian states were along the borders of China, China became very nervous at what was happening next door. In 1997, Deng Xiaoping died. Hong Kong reverted to China. And in 1999, 10 years after Tiananmen, Falun Gong staged a silent protest of 10,000 people. Falun Gong was a kind of a cult, a sect, S-E-C-T, that is, founded by Li Hongzhi. Li Hongzhi now lives in New York City. And anyhow, Falun Gong was based upon Chinese breathing exercises, the idea that you could focus one's qi or energy. A couple of months later, thousands of Falun Gong members were jailed, released, and the Chinese Communist Party generally declared the Falun Gong banned and called it a superstitious cult. China continued to join the world community in 2001 by joining the World Trade Organization. And in 2002, Hu Jintao became General Secretary of the CCP. One of your textbooks, the one by John Starr, talks in detail about the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River, and he uses it, I think, brilliantly to show the centrifugal forces of regionalism in China. How over 1 million people were displaced for this dam that was constructed for several purposes: to control flooding, to enable better navigation, to produce hydroelectric power. Construction started in 1994. It was completed in 2003. Be certain to read that section in Starr on the Three Gorges Dam, as it shows all of the differences between the provinces, and between different provinces vying for one another and disagreeing about things. 2012, Xi Jinping became General Secretary of the CCP. And if you want to learn more about the rank order of the economy of China, go ahead to this wonderful website. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help. Have a good day.